In my opinion, the Pennsylvania Railroad T1 is one of, if not the most beautiful locomotive classes of all time. Styled by designer Raymond Loewy, the T1s ran for barely a decade before being scrapped by the inevitable tide of dieselization. Their complicated duplex drive definitely not doing them any favors. Their short lifespan and perhaps still controversial design cemented their place in railroad mythology to the point that the T1 Trust actually wants to build a new one. I had wanted to build the T1 as soon as I started building scaled trains. To some extent, I consider previous models like the Ace Practice 4 at that time my masterpiece. The timing finally felt right when Big Ben Bricks released XL drivers and I started modeling in LDD. Nonetheless, I may have overreached in the immense undertaking of building such a large model for R40, though very few, if any, wide radius options existed at the time. In retrospect, I think the T1 is too big for R40. The 70-foot locomotive would remain my longest rigid train thing until the 85-foot P85s. Making the chassis navigate the tight turns proved quite a challenge, and I went between virtual and physical prototypes many times. At least I didn't have to power the engine since I originally intended to push it, though I did eventually build a power functions drivetrain into the tender, as described in the last T1 video. Even after all that iteration, the locomotive still makes a lot of compromises to navigate R40 geometry. Like all my passenger cars, I scaled the model slightly less than 1:48 to shrink the maximum dimensions as much as possible. Even then, the body generates considerable friction entering and exiting turns as it slides on the articulating chassis. The technically impressive tender drivetrain has a ton of gears that end up making it very inefficient, and the motors need to work very hard to go not that fast. Lastly, the whole thing still doesn't handle all R40 geometry well. It specifically doesn't like backing through switches right next to curves. I probably did not test this scenario nearly enough when designing the chassis. One of the tender wheels or one of the flange drivers will often pick the blades. To be fair, LEGO's own 10277 Crocodile doesn't like these as well, so I don't feel that bad about it. Early on, the unpowered drivers would slip on bumpy track since the weight would transfer from those wheels to the front and rear trucks. I eventually tried to take the weight off the bogies entirely by pinning them with a gap, enough for them to absorb bumps, but not enough for them to derail in turns. While this usually, if not always, solves the original problem, it exacerbates the friction between the boiler and the chassis. You can see how the end trucks tilt as they drag the body through a corner. Another aside, I don't like how the BBB XL wheels have this ridge on the inside of the rims. I don't quite understand why they made them this way. the raised boss in the center of the L drivers generates a lot less friction. I originally designed the chassis with straight sides, but the ridges scrubbed incessantly, and I eventually redesigned the frames with fluted sides such that only the hubs contact. This helps the friction situation a lot, and the engine actually rolls pretty smoothly on straight track. The chassis joins the body at the front and the back, and therefore requires an expansion joint, which I place between the 4th and 5th axles. I probably didn't build the boiler, my first big one, very efficiently. I filled it mostly with bricks instead of air, which again contributes to the friction issue. The model also uses some old parts, mostly hinges, which I can't really replace for lack of a good modern equivalent. Otherwise, it doesn't have too many greebles, as the prototype didn't have too many greebles. I won't talk too much about the tender since I went over it before, but I will say that I didn't really comprehend the inefficiency of the drivetrain until I had a good point of comparison. I'll show the comparison in an upcoming video, so stay tuned for that. I did measure the pulling power for this video, and I'll link to the big spreadsheet again in the description. The tender can pull about 180 grams with about 620 grams of weight, on the boundary of braking magnets. If I were to rebuild the T1, I would probably not insist on R40, since it looks pretty silly on R40 anyway, much like the P85s. At that point, I would almost certainly build a more efficient drivetrain in the engine and replace the inefficient one in the tender. Ultimately, I just need more data on the practicality of a wide radius only engine, and it depends a lot on what the club ends up doing for shows, if we ever have them again. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please subscribe if you like what we do, and have a nice day.